Fellas, fantasy fights have always been around in the UFC. Fights between two fighters that we really want to see and we think would match up really well, which we're realistically never going to see, which is why it's a fantasy. But there's been some fantasy fights in the UFC that have had a complete narrative shift from one narrative to another without ever happening. So we're going to be taking a look at a few examples of UFC fantasy fights that have switched narratives without even happening in the first place. And the first example of a fantasy matchup switching the narrative completely is Khabib versus Charles Oliveira. A few years ago, this was the fight that everyone wanted to see. This was just purely after Khabib retired from the sport, vacated the belt, and Charles Oliveira was the new guy in the lightweight division. Everybody was wanting to see this fight because Oliveira, unlike all of Khabib's opponents, was hyped up as this scary submission artist Adesanya in his title run, and he had great striking to back it up, and he seemed to be fairly well-rounded from the opponents that he faced. And he beat some of Khabib's best wins in dominant fashion, like he did when he faced Justin Gaethje, choked him out, like he did when he faced Dustin Poirier, choked him out, and other fights as well, like when he finished a wrestler in Michael Chandler. And the narrative originally going into this fight was that Khabib has never faced a submission threat like Charles Oliveira. Oliveira would smoke Khabib on the feet, and Charles is just more dangerous everywhere because of the submission threat and the striking that he's displayed in the UFC. That was the original narrative going into this fight, and that was why everyone wanted to see this fight, because they thought that Oliveira would have been the guy to beat Khabib. And this was kind of the narrative all up until Oliveira versus Makhachev, because obviously Oliveira faced Makhachev at UFC 280, and even though they're completely different fighters, Islam Makhachev is the closest thing that Oliveira's ever getting to Khabib. Islam Makhachev is the closest thing. I know they're different fighters, but if you want Khabib, the closest thing you're getting is Makhachev. And the fight resulted in Oliveira getting dominated. I mean, in the first round, Islam wasn't afraid to initiate the grappling, took him down in that first round, dominated him with the grappling, and then eventually got the submission against Charles Oliveira. And then he faced another wrestler when he faced Arman Tsarukyan at UFC 300, and it was the same thing. Okay, maybe not as dominant, but Arman Tsarukyan was able to cruise to a decision because of the wrestling, and he just displayed a lot of dominant wrestling in that fight. And the blueprint to beating Charles Oliveira was exposed, and the whole narrative surrounding this fight nowadays is that Khabib would maul Charles Oliveira, and if Islam Makhachev and Arman Tsarukyan could dominate Charles Oliveira with just pure wrestling, imagine what Khabib would do, because Khabib is still to this day one of the most dominant wrestlers we've had in the UFC. Everyone knows what he's going to do and what he's trying to do. He's trying to take you down and dominate you with wrestling, but nobody can stop it. He's still hyped up as one of the best, if not the best wrestler in the UFC history because of how dominant he was. And like I said, even though him and Islam Makhachev are completely different fighters, I would say from pure wrestling and pure wrestling dominance, Khabib was much more dominant than Islam Makhachev. So the new narrative surrounding the fight with Khabib and Oliveira is that Khabib would purely maul Charles Oliveira. And the reason this had a big narrative shift was purely because we'd never really seen Oliveira in his title run face these high-level wrestlers. It was still a question that was going to be answered, because we'd never seen him face Islam Makhachev. We'd never seen him face Arman Tsarukyan. The real big wrestling threat he had in his title run was Michael Chandler, and Chandler was just there to stand and bang and have a brawl. So the new narrative is that Khabib would maul Charles Oliveira. And I completely agree with that narrative, considering that Khabib's one of the most dominant wrestlers in Oliveira. The blueprint to beating Oliveira is just offensive wrestling. So that's the first fight that had a complete narrative shift. The next one is Israel Adesanya versus Khamzat Chimaev. This was always been hyped up as one of the best striker versus grappler matchups in the UFC. It's been a fantasy matchup for ages. I've always thought we've been super close to seeing this fight, and it was a fight that everyone wanted to see in the middleweight division, especially when Chimaev moved up and beat Usman. Adesanya versus Chimaev, two massive stars going at it. Everyone wanted to see this fight. And the original narrative was that, Adesanya's got the best takedown defense in the middleweight division. Chimaev would gas out after the first round, and Adesanya would just take him into deep waters. People were making this narrative based on Chimaev's last couple of fights with Usman, and specifically the fights with Usman and Burns, and I guess you can take into the weight miss with Kevin Holland, but he went life and death on the feet with Gilbert Burns, who is nowhere close to Adesanya striking, and even that ended up in a very, very close and, questionable decision. And then he faces Kamaru Usman on short notice, and apart from the first round, couldn't really get going against Usman and looked really gassed after that first round. Then again, another very close and controversial decision against Kamaru Usman. So everyone was expecting Israel Adesanya, this guy that has gone 5 rounds multiple times and has no problem going to a decision, and has shown that he's already got better stamina than obviously Chimaev, a better striker than anyone that Chimaev has ever faced, really good striker. And he's shown in his middleweight title run that he's got a good takedown defense as well. So the original narrative was that Adesanya, if he can survive that early onslaught, he's going to take Chimaev into deep waters and just purely finish him in those later rounds. But that kind of changed. I mean, if you look at Adesanya's past couple of fights, it gets to the point where he's lost 3 out of his last 4, and it was mainly the fight with Dricus du Plessis that really switched the narrative revolving Adesanya versus Chimaev, because Dricus du Plessis just manhandled him in that 4th round, took him down, found the submission, was able to submit Israel Adesanya. And the new narrative nowadays, surrounding this fight is that Adesanya will get mauled by Chimaev. If Chimaev couldn't ragdoll Kamaru Usman, he would kill Israel Adesanya. And like I said, easy got manhandled by Dricus du Plessis, because if you look at Adesanya Adesanya's record, he's still yet to face a grappler as good as Khamzat Chimaev, in my opinion. And the two semi-decent grapplers that he has faced, you know, he faced a lot of adversity from those guys, which is why he ended up losing those fights against Jan Blachowicz and Dricus du Plessis. So the new narrative revolving Adesanya versus Chimaev, even though it's still a close fight, and I wouldn't completely count Adesanya out, is that Chimaev would probably, just go out there and dominate Adesanya early on, and Adesanya's not going to be able to survive that early onslaught from Chimaev, because if he can't defend against Dricus du Plessis, and the way that he looked against Jan Blachowicz, imagine what a guy is dominant with grappling, like Khamzat Chimaev would do to Adesanya in those early rounds. So that's another fight that has had a complete narrative shift. The next one is Leon Edwards versus Islam Makhachev. When Leon was the champion at 170, this was like the next big fight. Everyone was expecting Leon to go out there and beat Belal Muhammad, and this was going to be the next big super fight in the UFC. It was Islam Makhachev's toughest test. It was a fight between two unstoppable champions, two guys that are dominating the pound-for-pound list right now. And this was the fact that everyone wanted to see. The original narrative was that, Leon Edwards has great takedown defense. His stand-up is great. He's overall just a nightmare matchup for Islam Makhachev, and he's used to grapplers as well. You look at his past three fights previous to the fight with Belal Muhammad. It was just grappler after grappler after grappler, and he was progressively getting better in every fight. His takedown defense was improving. The pressure didn't really seem to be getting to him, and he even started showing offensive grappling when he was facing guys like Colby Covington. So the narrative was that Leon Edwards was by far going to be the biggest test for Islam Makhachev, especially when he'd gone life and death with 145-pound Alexander Volkanovski, never mind 170-pound Leon Edwards. And this all ended when Edwards faced Belal Muhammad at UFC 304. This was the fact that kind of exposed the blueprint of Leon Edwards, because he got dominated in this fight. Belal Muhammad stuck to his game plan, pressured Leon Edwards, and just purely dominated Leon Edwards with grappling. Not even just grappling, but on the boxing as well. And the new narrative surrounding this fight is that Makhachev would have mauled Leon if this was to ever happen. Not only just maul him in grappling, but even just outstrike him. Because Leon got dominated and backed up by Belal Muhammad, the blueprint is there to beating Leon Edwards. And I think the blueprint is pretty obvious. Just be a pressure wrestler. Usman showed it in the second time they fought. Belal Muhammad showed it. Leon doesn't do well with pressure. That was exactly what Colby Covington was supposed to do. So the new narrative is that he would get mauled by Islam Makhachev, who is one of the most dominant wrestlers right now in the UFC. And it's not even just the grappling as well, it's also the striking. Leon was getting outboxed by Belal Muhammad. And I know there's the big threat of the takedown, but he was getting outboxed by Belal. Islam Makhachev was one of the best strikers at 155, and I would say he's a much better striker and much better at mixing it up than Belal Muhammad. So I think the narrative going into this fight has completely changed. It's not really this massive fight anymore. Even though I would be intrigued to see how Makhachev would do at 170 against Leon, I think I would definitely favour Makhachev a lot more going into this fight based on Edwards' performance against Belal Muhammad. So that's another fight that had a complete narrative shift. The next one is in the heavyweight division, and it's between Sergey Pavlovich and Cyril Gane. Yeah, Sergey Pavlovich and Cyril Gane. Out of all the fantasy fights, this has always been, a couple of months ago, one of my favourite fantasy fights in the UFC. Previous to Pavlovich getting knocked out by Tom Aspinall, this was the dream in the heavyweight division. This was going to feed generations. Cyril Gane versus Sergey Pavlovich was that fight in the heavyweight division. And the original narrative was that, it's the best heavyweight strikers going at it. Pavlovich is like Cyril Gane, but scarier. And a lot of people thought, because of the onslaught that Pavlovich was doing to other contenders, that he would maul Cyril Gane. And I don't blame them. He was on a 6-fight, first-round finish streak against, he'd beaten Curtis Blades as well. Doing that to Curtis Blades is a really good win for Sergey Pavlovich. He was on a streak. He was on an onslaught, just finishing contender after contender, making it look easy, beating some of Cyril Gane's best wins in a super quick fashion. And after he went out and did it to Curtis Blades, who was a difficult matchup for a lot of people, and especially not only just that, but the fact that he was doing it so much quicker than Cyril Gane. Gane takes time when he faces opponents. He likes breaking people down. He's not really a quick first-round finisher. Sergey Pavlovich, he has no overtime, no time to waste. He just gets it done as soon as possible. So the narrative was that, Pavlovich is going to be a really difficult test for Cyril Gane. And it's definitely switched in these past couple of fights. Obviously got the fight with Tom Aspinall at UFC 295. Got knocked out on the feet by Tom Aspinall. Then he faces Alexander Volkov, a guy that Cyril Gane has beaten before. And got kind of battered and bruised and bullied by Alexander Volkov at UFC Saudi Arabia. And the new narrative surrounding this fight is that, listen, Pavlovich got knocked out by Aspinall and dominated by Volkov. Cyril Gane would batter Sergey Pavlovich. And if you look at Pavlovich and his wins, he can only really seem to outstrike these short, fat brawlers. You look at Cyril Gane, he's beaten every single fighter that he's ever faced, that he's ever beaten, should I say, on the feet. He beat Volkov on the feet. He beat, obviously, Rosenstrike on the feet, Lewis on the feet, Tuivasa on the feet. He's never really lost on the feet as Cyril Gane. And, you know, you look at the guys that Pavlovich has beaten, like I said, it tends to be people who are engaging in a brawl. Everyone wants to brawl with Sergey Pavlovich, and that's why they messed up and why Pavlovich was able to get the win. So the narrative is that Ciryl Gane would just pick apart Sergey Pavlovich. He's a much more technical striker. He's beaten better strikers than Pavlovich. He's much better on the feet. He's just much better technicality as well than Sergey Pavlovich. So I feel like the narrative surrounding this fight, even though it would still be a fun fight in the heavyweight division, is that Ciryl Gane would cruise to a decision and just be able to pick apart Sergey Pavlovich just like Alexander Volkov did. Another fight that had a complete narrative shift is Israel Adesanya versus Jon Jones. There was actually a time when Adesanya versus Jones wasn't too far off happening. You'd got Adesanya, this newcomer in the UFC. This guy was on a rise against the greatest of all time. They were exchanging words on Twitter. They had beef on Twitter. Two of the biggest stars in the sport as well. This was a fight that was actually really close to happening in the UFC. Between Adesanya and Jones at 205, and the narrative was that this is a super fight at 205, the biggest fight you can make in the UFC, because Adesanya at the time was the next big thing in the UFC. Jones was kind of looking washed based on his past couple of performances, and people thought that Adesanya would be able to outstrike him and just purely defend the takedowns. I'm not saying Adesanya would have been a massive favourite, but Adesanya was definitely a lot more favoured than he would have been nowadays, and Dana was actually not afraid of entertaining this fight. He said he likes the idea of this fight, and I don't blame him, because it would have made the amount of pay-per-views that this would have done, Adesanya versus Jones, would have been crazy. But yeah, the original narrative was that Adesanya would have not necessarily been able to get it done, but it would have been a much more competitive fight than we view nowadays, because like I said, Adesanya was on the rise. He was this big star. He was the champion in the middleweight division. He looked like he was there to stay. He had a really good run in the UFC, undefeated in the UFC, taking guys on, outstriking everyone that he faced. He seemed to be the new guy. In Jones's last couple of performances, he was having these really razor-close performances, going to a decision with guys like Anthony Smith, and a lot of people thought this was Jones's way out, and Adesanya's, people thought this was Adesanya going to be, Jones passing on the torch to Israel Adesanya, and it was the new guy taking out the old guy. And, because Adesanya's just displayed this dominant striking in his entire UFC career. And that was kind of the original narrative surrounding Adesanya versus Jones. Until the fight with Jan Blachowicz. This was obviously Adesanya's debut at 205 when he faced Jan Blachowicz for the light heavyweight belt. And not only did Jan Blachowicz outstrike Israel Adesanya, but he dominated him with the grappling. This was the fight where we saw that Adesanya is very beatable in the UFC. Took his first loss. And all it took was this fight with Jan Blachowicz for everyone to realise that this would not have been a competitive fight with Jon Jones. And the new narrative that has kind of stuck ever since is that if Adesanya is getting out wrestled by guys like Jan Blachowicz, and I guess if you talk nowadays, Dricus du Plessis, Jon Jones would have mauled him. Jones would have submitted Adesanya like it's breakfast. Like I said before, Adesanya got submitted by Dricus du Plessis, dominated in grappling by Jan Blachowicz. Imagine what Jon Jones would have done. Jon Jones, a guy that is known for his crafty takedowns, known for his submission game, known for having some of the best wrestling in the light heavyweight division at the time. Imagine what Jon Jones would have done if he would have faced Adesanya. I think if this fight would have ever happened, it would have been a crime. Jon Jones would have gone out there, dominated him in the first round, maybe even found a submission quicker than he did against Ciryl Gane, to be completely honest. So the new narrative surrounding Adesanya versus Jones compared to the old narrative is that Jones would have just simply completely dominated Israel Adesanya and got the submission in the first round, and I don't blame anyone for thinking that. And then the final narrative shift, ironically, is Ben Askren versus Kamaru Usman. There was actually a time when Askren versus Usman was supposed to be a fight in the welterweight division, or a fight that people thought could potentially happen. Askren was on the rise. He debuted in the UFC. He was making a lot of noise. Usman was the new champion of the welterweight division, and the narrative was that Askren's the real deal. At the time, he was undefeated. Usman doesn't know wrestling like Askren, because Askren had this dominant wrestling background behind him, and Usman can't toe stomp Ben Askren like he's toe stomping guys like Woodley and, I guess if you look in the future, Jorge Masvidal. People thought this was going to be a big threat to Usman because of the wrestling that Askren had, and I don't really blame him as well. Askren, you look at his background in ONE FC, dominated everyone. He was this big wrestling prospect that joined the UFC and then debuted in the UFC as well after his performances at ONE FC, beat Robbie Lawler, and even though it was a bit of a bad win, it was an early stoppage, it shouldn't have really stopped in the first place. The submission was definitely fluky. He got his win in the UFC against Robbie Lawler. And Usman was having these performances, these really lackluster, boring performances against guys like Woodley, and he just wasn't really that interesting of a fighter. People thought that Askren was here to save the day in the welterweight division, and again, it was a fight that was actually kind of talked about, and even though it wasn't like the next big thing necessarily, people thought that this was a fight that could potentially happen in the welterweight division. That was all All up until, obviously, the ironic fight with the iconic fight with Askren and Jorge Masvidal, where he took that knee, got knocked out stiff by Jorge Masvidal, and he then got submitted by Damian Maia, and then after that, Usman went on to get one of the best title reigns in in the welterweight division history. So the new narrative is that Askren sucked, and I think most people see that. Usman would have beaten Askren any way that he likes. One got knocked out by Masvidal, and one put Masvidal to sleep. And I think most people would have expected, nowadays at least, that if this fight was to happen, Usman would have gone out there and just dominated Ben Askren like it's nothing. It would have been an easy fight for Kamaru Usman, and this would not have been competitive in the slightest. So those are some of the biggest fantasy fights that never happened and had a complete narrative shift without ever happening. Like I said, let me know if I've missed any fantasy fights out, and let me know your thoughts on this video. Thank you for watching.